in their activity as abolitionists, and one of the earliest who used the definition is Lucretia Mott, they then would go to meetings, abolition meetings, and they'd be shut out because they were women. And they would not be allowed in, or they would not be allowed to vote, or they would not be allowed to speak. And so that led them directly to suffrage. And so the two great movements, the two huge social movements that really have been the signature movements that have helped to perfect this union, abolition and suffrage, started that early, and it started with these women. So I think that they are, wonderfully exemplary, and I think it's important for people in this country, particularly girls, to understand these huge contributions that the women in our history have made. But I will admit that you also, when you're doing this kind of work, come upon some just hysterically delightful moments. And that did happen on this subject of the orphanage here in Washington. Louisa Catherine Adams, John Quincy Adams' wife, wrote these wonderful chatty letters back to her father-in-law, John Adams, who was missing Abigail, who had died. And John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State, and he was running for president. But of course, you never really ran for president. So your wife ran you for president. And she talked about it quite explicitly. My campaign and my vocation to get him elected president and all of that. And so she would write back to John Adams everything that was going on in Washington, and you really learn a huge amount. Most of these letters have never been published. And so I'm sitting in I write in the basement. It's the kids' playroom, because it's the only place I can spread out everything and not have it mess up the house. And so I was sitting in my basement reading a letter from Louisa Catherine Adams that I had not sort of noticed before. And I just couldn't believe it, because it was the year of the Missouri Compromise, 1820. And everybody was already running for president everybody was already getting nominated for president for the 1824 election. They were getting nominated in 1818, because everyone knew Monroe would run again in 1820 and be elected. So they were already working on 1824. So you think this last election was long? Nowhere near as long as that. And so she's running her campaign. The Missouri Compromise took a long time it was the first one. It took a long time to hammer out. So Congress stayed in session much longer than usual. They usually adjourned in March. They stayed until May. Finally, they leave. It was a mess. They're running out of ice. They're running out of food. It's, all of that. They finally leave. In June, she goes to a meeting of the trustees of the orphan asylum. And they say to her, "We're going to need a new building next year." And she says, "Why? What?" She said, "Well, because Congress is here so long." And she says, "What?" The session had been so long that the Congress had left behind 40 pregnant women who would need to avail themselves of our services. And she says, she's so furious, and she says to John Adams, "So I propose that those great and moral fathers take the $2 additional in pay that they've voted for themselves a day and contribute it to the building of an orphanage." There were only 187 members of Congress. Now, some of them might have been recidivists, I don't know, but I'm reading this letter, and I couldn't believe it. I ran upstairs, to start cooking dinner, and Steve came down, and I said, "Look at this! Does this say what I think it does?" And he says, "Oh yeah." Now, it doesn't get any better than that. You don't read any of that in the books about the men, and you really get a much fuller sense of what the society was like and what the men were like. The founding fathers we think of as these bronze and marble deities, and of course their wives did not think of them that way, and I actually think it does them a great service to write about them as human beings, as opposed to some gods. And I think it does the whole country a service, because I think there's a notion that, you know, they were then and they were some, you know, special form of human, and that we can never replicate that, and we have to take everything they said, you know, and interpret it as if it was handed down from Sinai. And that's just not the case. They were extraordinary men. They were dedicated men. They were very human men. And I think that you learn that when you read their letters to the women, when you read the women's letters to each other, to the women's letters to them, and particularly when you read the women's letters to each other. So, with those thoughts about the books to date, I would be delighted to take your questions.